Hello everyone, this is Patrón, pattern making for creators, pattern drafting and sewing online academy. I'm Andrea López and in this video we're going to sew the Isila dress. Here we have the dress model. We have the body with the sleeves, and what I'm more interested in is to see the skirt. The skirt is made of two pieces. The upper skirt piece is a half circular one, and the bottom piece, which is gathered, is just a fabric rectangle. How do we make this piece? How do we cut it? If our fabric is 140 centimeters wide, we'll have to unfold the fabric and we'll cut the rectangle that on the pattern has a quite small shape. We'll have to cut it with the full width of the fabric 3 times. 3 times to get a flight similar to the one on the prototype. Said all that, if we want to gather the fabric like that and have that flounced look, we need that length to be longer than the length of the bottom of half circular skirt. That's why we need so many pieces. Now well, if we wanted the difference to be smaller, which I don't recommend, my advice is for it to be a rectangle of at least 4 meters total. Here we'd have about 420 or 430 meters. If we wanted it to have a smaller length, we'd just have to cut less pieces or shorter pieces. And if we wanted it to have even more flight, we'd need, for example, adding another piece. This way we're cutting the pieces to the grain line, but if we had lots of fabric, and so we would avoid later all those seams when joining all the pieces together, we could also cut it against the grain line and make it in one go. So that there would only be a single seam. But this is just if we have a lot of fabric. To use it in a more efficient way, the best is doing as I mentioned. Said that, once we have the pieces, it's advisable cutting 3 of them for us to get the prototype model. We'll sew the seams. We'll get a circular piece we'll have to gather on the top area to fit the length of our half circular skirt. When sewing these 2 pieces together, it will also be advisable to split the length in 4 identical parts. One, 2, 3, and 4, and this one also in 4 identical parts, so that later, when distributing the gathers, we'll have these references. And now we start sewing. Let's start sewing the body. Optionally, if your fabric needs it or if you want to, you can interface the pieces. Personally, I've interfaced all the pieces and I've cut the lining identical to the outer pieces, but I won't interface it. This time, because I'm using a linen fabric, I'm going to make a lining too. First, I'll start sewing all the body pieces together by the vertical side seams. Starting from the center front, I'll sew the front side piece to the side piece, and the back side piece. We'll leave the center back open. Hold it all with pins. Should I interface my pieces? It depends on the fabric you're using. If it's too thin, it will be mandatory to add an interfacing, even if it's a thin one, or if we want a more formal look to it. The more interfaced a garment is, the more formal it will look. Separately, we'll do the same with the lining pieces. Sew them all together, leaving the center back open. Once all the stitchings have been made, press all the seams open. The front side piece has a curved shape, so we'll have to notch it before pressing, and we'll use a tailor's cushion to press it with a curved shape. We'll also do that with the lining pieces. This way we'll have separate outer and inner bodies. Reserve them and let's move to the sleeve. First we have a small inner sleeve and then an outer, much longer sleeve. But as you'll see, the ends match the shape of the armhole. What we have to do is gathering all that center area and fit it to the length of the inner sleeve. On the other hand, the outer sleeve is a bit longer, so the volume will later hang. By hand or with a sewing machine, make some gathering stitches along the top and bottom areas of the sleeve, without touching the armhole part. Gather and adapt the whole length using the inner sleeve as base. You can lightly press the gathering area for it not to move too much, but don't do it so hard that you flatten the pleats. Just give it a bit of shape. Next, we're going to sew the side, placing the outer sleeve right to right, and separately the same thing for the inner sleeve. Pass a stitching, press the seam open and place the inner sleeve inside the outer one. Aligning right to right. We'll align the bottom parts by adjusting the gathering. Distribute the gathers evenly along the bottom of the sleeve. Pass a stitching to fix it, and then we can pull the inner sleeve out. Now we'll put it inside the outer one, aligning them reverse to reverse. You can now remove the gathering bastings, and we'll leave the sleeve open on the top where the armhole is, for now. Before moving on, we're going to baste both layers together on the bottom. We'll make the basting about 2 cm from the edge, holding the whole gathering. This basting will help us holding the whole volume of the sleeve, so we can now make a stitching 1 or 1.5 cm from the edge. The part coming now is a bit tricky. We have to finish all the upper area where the gathering is. Profiting from the open area on the armhole, we'll try placing the top of the sleeve right to right on all the area where the gathering is. It will be a bit difficult. Now we'll have to keep pulling fabric from the inside so we can keep facing the right sides of both pieces. In fact, we won't be able to make the stitching from one side to the other in a single go. We'll start on one side and we'll get up to about the center of the sleeve, make the stitching, turn it around, and then we'll go from the other side until we get to the center of the sleeve again. To show it in a more clear way, let's imagine here we have the bottom of the sleeve and on the top we have the gathering and the inner sleeve. What we're looking for is folding the seam allowance of the inner sleeve inwards, as well as the gathered outer sleeve seam allowance, so that once finished it would look somewhat like this. If that method seems too tricky, we can place them like this and, by hand, sew and finish it by hand too. But because on the sleeve we have the armhole area open, this side, my suggestion is to turn the pieces so that they are right to right and sewing that seam from the inside with the sewing machine instead of by hand. Once sewn, turn it and we have the effect we were looking for. It's tricky because the gap we have to turn it is pretty small, but here I have half the sleeve done. I remove the pins, turn it inside out, we can see a part of the top area has its finishing done. Now, on the other side, I continue. Now, if I turn it again, I have it all finished and the only area we have still open is the armhole area. Remove the bastings, and what I'll do now is sewing both fabric layers with a basting on the armhole area for them to act as a single layer. You could also lightly press it for the lining not to unfold outwards. The sleeves are now ready. Get the body back and place the sleeve on top of it, aligning the armhole areas. Hold it all with pins. Pass a stitching to sew the sleeve. Do so on both sleeves. Notch the curved seam and get the lining body. From the center front, we are going to place the lining right to right with the outer body and we'll go towards the sides following the neckline. The sleeve will remain between the outer body and the lining. Once we've passed a stitching by seam allowance from center back to the center back on the other side, the whole neckline will be sewn and the sleeves will be pocketed between both bodies. Notice how I'm aligning all the body seams to be sure all the segments match. Cut the seam allowance of the corners and notch the curved areas. If you want to, you can make a net stitching on the lining following the neckline. Fold the seam allowance towards the lining and pass a stitching right next to the seam, pressing the seam allowance that's on the inside. Make that stitching on the back up to where you can reach because you won't be able to reach the corner. Stop and make the edge stitching on the front too, and then on the other side of the back. Now we press the whole neckline. On the center back, we'll add an invisible zip. But first, we have to add the skirt on the waist. Grab the skirt which, if you noticed, is a half circle one. From the center front, we'll place the skirt right to right with the body towards the sides. Remember, a half circular skirt will be to the bias, meaning it's easy for it to unwillingly grow larger. Look how I had a 1 cm excess poking from the center back. Don't worry about it, if it's just 1 cm we can cut it parallelly downwards to the bottom. What's not alright is for us to have a 5 cm excess. A little bit is not a problem, adjust it and that's enough. Once it's all held with pins, pass a stitching to sew it. You can notch it a bit and press the seam upwards. This step is really optional. You can leave the seam upwards and it will remain hidden by the lining, or you could press the whole seam, including the lining, downwards and overlock it. If you press it upwards, once the zip is in place, we'll use the lining to cover. Now we're going to add the invisible zip. In our skirt pattern, we have to have the notch marking where the zip gets to, so top to bottom we'll place it. Hold it with pins and stop on the notch. We have two options, placing the zip from the top edge, from the neckline, and just half the zip, or leaving a 1 or 1.5 centimeter gap from the neckline and start adding the zip from there. In this method, we'll add a hook and eye above the zip. Before we start placing the zip, we have to choose if we want to finish the back seam on the skirt with an overlocking, which is a simpler finishing, or using a tape, which will result in this effect. As you can see, it will also be much more work than an overlocking. If we do it with an overlocking, we have to make it top to bottom on the center back, on both sides of it, with the overlock or a zigzag. And then we can add the zip, but otherwise we'll place the zip like I'm doing right now, leaving the edges of the fabric raw. The zip is now held in place. Pass the stitching, close it, make sure the horizontal seams match, lightly press it, and next we'll see the steps to finish the seam using a tape. From where we finished sewing the zip, we're going to leave a small 3 or 4 centimeter gap and cut the rest. Now take the lining fabric, which is a thin one, and we're going to cut long 3 centimeter wide strips to the grain line. The length of the strips doesn't matter, it just has to be longer than the center back seam we're binding with it. We need 2 of them. Before we start with the seams, cut a small piece to finish the bottom of the zip. We just have to sew this small piece at the end of the zip as if sewing a bias step binding the bottom. We can do it with the machine, but it's such a small gap and the teeth of the zip may cause some trouble that I prefer doing it by hand. It doesn't take much time. The sides of the piece can be directly cut with the scissors because they'll be covered by the tape binding the whole seam top to bottom. Now grab the long strips. You can sew them with the zip closed or open, in whichever way is the most comfortable to you. With these fabric strips, we're going to do the same thing we've just done. We'll bind the seam as if using a bias tape. So first, we'll sew it on one side of the fabric. It doesn't matter which one. As we get to the zip, we'll also bind the zip. And we'll get past the waistline. There's no need to go higher because the lining will close that area. Pass stitching. With the help of the iron, we'll cover the edge of the fabric, as if sewing a bias tape. We can hold it with pins, we can baste it, whatever you feel more comfortable with. Once it's all held in place, you can fix it with a machine stitching or even by hand. Do so on both sides. The seams are now finished. Remember, we still have the center back seam open on the bottom of the skirt. So now we'll place both sides right to right and we'll pass stitching from the bottom up to where the zip stitching starts. Press the seam open. It's important to check the right of the fabric to see we don't have creases or markings at the end of the zip. It has to look like a straight, clean seam. Now we'll finish the lining. We'll fold all the seam allowance inwards. Press and hold the whole center back contour and waistline with pins. Once we have it all held, we're going to close the lining by hand. On the waistline, you're free to pass a machine stitching, but if you do so, it will be visible from the right of the dress too. If you don't mind it, there's no problem. If you don't want any stitching to be visible, you'll have to do it by hand, with slip stitches. As a last step, if we left the gap on the top, we'll place a hook and eye on the center back top neckline, above the zip. The dress looks like this for now. We could leave it like this if we want it to be mini, of course, but now we're going to add the ruffles to the bottom. We just have to make the gathered bottom ruffle. Here I have a pretty wide rectangle. Remember what we saw at the beginning on the whiteboard? And we have to make a circular piece by sewing all the pieces together by the sides. Once the pieces are sewn by the sides, we'll have the length we want. On the bottom we'll make a double hem and we'll fix it with stitching. Press the hem. On the top part, we'll have to pass a gathering basting, just like we did on the sleeves. My advice is to not pass a single thread, but to split the piece in 4 or 5 identical parts and pass different threads. This way, if a thread breaks, you won't have to make the whole piece again. Ideally, you'd make it in 4 parts so, later, when sewing it to the skirt, you can divide the skirt bottom in 4 identical segments, which will help you distributing the gathers better and to make it even along the contour. Once the gathering of the ruffles is ready, take the dress and, starting from the center back, we'll place the ruffles right to right with the bottom of the dress. Hold the bottom with pins and make sure the gathers are evenly distributed, that there are no areas heavily gathered and others almost flat. Little by little we'll distribute it evenly. That's why I mentioned it's a good idea to split both the skirt and the ruffle in 4 segments, so we can distribute it more easily now. Once it's all held in place, pass an overlocked stitching or a zigzag and then press it all. The seam allowance will be pointing upwards or towards the waist of the skirt. If you want to flatten the volume of the gathering with the iron, that's up to you. And here we end the sewing. If you like it, see you again in future garment videos.